My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar on health and safety issues during the pandemic. I'm the Vice President of the Stitfeld Handy Group, and at the Stitfeld Handy Group, we do a number of things. We offer training on negotiation, mediation and conflict resolution, how to have difficult conversations and deal with difficult people. And we also provide services to our clients, mostly around workplace issues. So that can be workplace mediation for people who may be having a dispute in the workplace restoration when there's a team and maybe they're looking for ways to function more effectively, coaching, a variety of things. And like many of you, we've transitioned to offering our services online and remotely. So we now offer virtual instructor-led training, which is essentially live training. It's just done online. So role plays and exercises, but it's all done online. And we now provide our mediation services and coaching services online as well. So whether we're offering training or services, historically, we were doing it all in person. But again, like many of you, we've had to transition to doing that online. But whether online or in person, whether it's mediation or training, our purpose is always the same. So our purpose at the Stitfeld Handy Group is to try to help people to live and work better together. And these days, living and working better together are presenting some unique challenges. So one of the things that we decided amongst ourselves when we started to work remotely and when the pandemic occurred was to try to find additional ways that we might be able to reach out to people and to meet our purpose of helping people to live and work better together. So one of the ideas that we came up with was the idea of offering short, free webinars that would hopefully provide people with some relevant information and some tips and techniques that would be helpful to people as we all navigate these challenging and choppy waters. So when we thought of the idea of Expert Corner, what we hoped to do was to draw upon the expertise within our own organization and within, our broader network of people. And one of the first people who came to our minds was Doug MacLeod. And Doug, we were introduced to Doug many years ago when he took a workshop on negotiation and mediation with us. But he's here today because of his deep expertise in labor and employment issues. So Doug is the founder of the MacLeod Law Firm, which is a Canadian labor and employment law firm. He's got almost 30 years of experience in the field. And in fact, in 2018, he received the Award of Excellence from his colleagues at the Ontario Bar Association's Labor and Employment Law. So really a pretty significant accolade from your peers. And the other thing I think that's notable about Doug, including the breadth and depth of his experience, is that Doug and his associates provide advice and representation to both employers and employees. And for those of you who are familiar with the field, you'll know that it's unusual to come upon lawyers in the field who have expertise representing both sides, and so who understand the challenges from both sides. Doug also writes a blog, which I have found to be very informative. It's succinct, it's clearly written, so when you're looking for information through complex situations, it can be very useful. So those are some of the things that drew us to think that Doug would be a great person if we could include him in our expert series. So we were very grateful when he agreed to contribute his expertise through this webinar. So in a moment, I'm going to invite Doug to join me, but I just want to deal with a couple of the logistical things about the webinar. So in addition to Doug, two of my colleagues are providing a terrific assistance to make this webinar possible. So Jason Stitt is going to be behind the scenes, and he's going to be monitoring the questions that you send in. So if you have a question, you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there's an icon that has a Q&A symbol. Please just click on the icon, a window will open, you can type in your question, and it will go to Jason. We then encourage you to close your window so that you can continue to watch the webinar. What Jason is going to do is he's going to read through the questions because we have a very large audience today. He's going to read through the questions and try to identify themes that might be relevant to a broad group of people within the audience. So please note that your question may not be worded exactly as you've submitted it because it may be blended with related questions, but your question hopefully will still be submitted to be answered by Doug today. We'll do our best to have Doug answer as many questions as possible, but as I'm sure you can appreciate, the time will be somewhat limited. Also, we have the assistance of Elizabeth Jameson. So Elizabeth is doing all the technical things behind the scenes. So the fact that you can see me, the fact that you'll be able to hear us, the fact that you can submit questions, all of those things are due to Elizabeth. So Elizabeth will be helping us behind the scenes. At 11:45, so just as we conclude the webinar, there will be an opportunity to participate in a very short poll. The purpose of the poll is just to help us understand a little bit more about the audience and what you might want to have in future webinars, topics you might want us to address. At the moment, we're planning our next webinar for July 14th at 11 o'clock. We'll obviously send out more information about it, but the focus of the webinar is going to be how to have difficult conversations related to COVID. So whether that's speaking to somebody about maintaining the physical distance, whether it's requesting that somebody wear a mask, all the specific kinds of difficult conversations that we might now have to have during COVID. Also, at the end of the webinar, we're going to send out a resource sheet to everybody who attended today. We'll hope to get that out within the next day or two. We try to design the resource sheet to include information that's been addressed in the webinar and additional information. So we'll make sure that gets out shortly. And then lastly, we've invited Doug because of his terrific expertise in this area, but please note that what he'll be providing today is legal information. He's not in a position to provide legal advice based on the brief questions that people are submitting. So if you do need legal advice, we would encourage you to reach out to Doug directly or to other lawyers who have employment expertise. So to retain them to provide you with legal advice. So the focus of this webinar is on sharing legal information. Okay, so on that note, I am going to invite Doug to join us. So good morning, Doug. There we are. Good morning, nice to see you. And I'll just unmute you, Doug, for a moment so you can say hello. There you go. Good morning.
Good morning, and good morning to your participants.
Thank you. Okay, so I just thought, Doug, maybe I would start with the sort of general question. I was thinking this morning that there have probably been health and safety issues in the workplace as long as there's been workplaces. There probably wasn't health and safety legislation, but there were health and safety issues as long as there have been workplaces. But of course, the focus these days is around health and safety issues that are being presented by the pandemic, and particularly now that people are going back into the workplace and workplaces are reopening. So I was just wondering if you could talk, as a sort of starting point around where people might find information around what the standards should be as they return to the workplace.
Sure. The main health and safety law in Ontario is called the Occupational Health and Safety Act, or OSHA, and every jurisdiction in Canada has one, and in the States the same thing. And as you sort of alluded to, it's been around for a long time. There are 26 regulations underneath the Act. The industrial establishments reg is probably the one that most people who are listening are familiar with. Now, of course, OSHA does not contemplate COVID, and so there's nothing specific in the legislation right now on it. As of yesterday, the Ministry of Labor, which administers OSHA, indicated it had inspected almost 11,000 workplaces since COVID broke out. There's been over 66 orders, which is an order to comply with one section of OSHA or another, and they've issued 23 stop work orders. So the Ministry of Labor, has been very busy since COVID hit. Now, the Ministry of Labor has also provided some really good resources that I'm just going to quickly refer to. So on their website, if you go to the Ontario Ministry of Labour website, they've got a section called Resources to Prevent COVID in the Workplace. And so they've got posters there that you can download and print. And they've got sector-specific guidance for over 100 sectors in the economy. So if you haven't gone to that website and had a look at the safety-specific guidance for your sector, please do so. One of the reasons for that is under OSHA, an employer has an obligation to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of the workers. So that, I think, at a minimum would include making sure you were familiar with those sector-specific guidance sheets. Yesterday, the ministry also published something that I think is very valuable to people. It's called Developing Your COVID-19 Workplace Safety Plan. And so here are the 6 questions that they cover off in this document. How will you ensure all workers know how to keep themselves safe from exposure? How will you screen for COVID? How will you control the risk of transmission? What do you do if there's a potential case or suspected exposure to COVID? How will you manage new risks created by changes in the way you operate your business? And how do you make sure your plan is working? So this is, again, it was just released yesterday. It's on the Ministry of Labour website. I encourage everybody to have a look at it if they haven't already. Public Health Ontario has also got a lot of really good resources online. So if you Google Public Health Ontario, just look up COVID-19 public resources, and it has a lot of really helpful information that can be applied in the workplace as well.
Okay, so it sounds like those resources would be great places perhaps for employers to start in order to be informed and in order to meet their requirement to, you said that, that it'll be reasonable in the circumstances in terms of protecting their employees.
Yeah.
Some of the questions that we received in advance were from employees who were saying, what if I return to the workplace and when I get into the workplace, I don't feel safe? So maybe I feel that my employer hasn't met the standards or something's going on and I don't feel safe in the workplace. What would happen in that circumstance?
Well, there is a provision in OSHA that deals with work refusals. So it's been there for a long time. And it's basically a 2-step process. If an employee at work thinks that they're exposed to a health and safety risk, then they get to put up their hand and say, I don't feel safe. And at that point, the employer has to do an investigation. So they look into the safety concern the employees identified. If there's a health and safety representative in the workplace, they have to be involved. If there's a joint health and safety committee, they have to be involved as well. At the end of the investigation, the employer either agrees with the employee and deals with it, or disagrees with the employee. If they disagree, then the employee can escalate to the second stage, which is a call to the Ministry of Labour. And the Ministry of Labour will send out an inspector and do their own independent objective investigation into the employee's concerns. And then that inspector will make a decision. So yes, an employee can trigger that work refusal process if they feel unsafe.
And what happens in terms of the employee being paid during that time, during the period of the work refusal and while the investigations are being completed?
During both stages of the investigation, the employee is removed from the part of the workplace they feel unsafe, and they're paid during that investigation process.
And you said the part of the workplace that is feeling unsafe. So one option might be for the employer to relocate the employee to a different, if they had a different location, or if there was a different way of ensuring that the employee was safe while the existing space was investigated. That would be an option.
Yeah, so sort of the typical situation is a machine. So an employee maybe normally works with a machine and it's not guarded properly, or there's anyway, the employees identified some concern, then they'd remove them from where the machine is and put them in another part of the workplace.
Okay. Okay. And so one of the questions that we received was, what is the employer's ability? So, because part of maintaining safety in the workplace these days may include people being asked to wear masks and things like that. So what is the employer's authority, for lack of a better word, to ensure that people wear masks? Or what if they have an employee who was refusing to wear a mask?
Okay, so as you may know, the premier yesterday, although he's not making masks mandatory, he's strongly recommended that people wear masks in where they can't socially distance, or they're in places where they're more likely to spread. So there is sort of public health guidance in that area. Quite apart from that, an employer has the right or power to implement reasonable rules. So under the rubric of taking every precaution reasonable in the circumstances, they decide to implement a mask wearing policy, then they could do that. If the employee refused, the employer hopefully could convince them why it's necessary to do it and why it's necessary for the protection of other workers, not necessarily the person wearing the mask, and convince them to wear it. But if they didn't, then they could in the right circumstances discipline the employee for refusing to wear it.
I see. Okay. And so questions come in that says, how should we handle workers who are in the risk group identified as being at risk by the government? So if they're people who are particularly at high risk as a result of COVID, are there special requirements for those workers?
I'm not aware of any specific requirements, but an employer has a duty to accommodate a disability. So if an employee went to their doctor and the doctor said to the employer, this person has an underlying health condition, and I'm recommending that the following accommodation measures be taken, then the employer would have to respond to it as they would any other accommodation request.
Okay. And so we were talking about an employee coming into the workplace and identifying themselves as feeling unsafe, or what can the employer do in terms of ensuring that other people wear masks? What if the employee refuses to return to the workplace at all? So it's not that they've come in and decided that they feel it's unsafe. For whatever mix of reasons, they're saying, I don't feel safe coming into the workplace, so I'm not coming at all. How would that?
Well, I guess just a general refusal without any reason is difficult to deal with. If there's no good reason for it, then you could, I suppose, take the position the person has quit, right? One of your responsibilities as an employee is to show up for work. Okay. And so unless you have a good reason for not coming to work, it could be considered a quit. Another way to approach it would be to say, we've directed you to come to work and you haven't, so we're going to discipline you. So that would be another way. That I think what I would do is ask the employee why. Like, why won't they come to work? Sort of do what you do, find out what the underlying interest is and find out what's the reason they don't want to come. So a bald no is not that helpful, actually. And so I would start a difficult conversation with them and find out what, why they're taking that position. I note that there's been issues come up under the CERB, whether people are eligible for the CERB if they're recalled to work and don't come back to work.
Right.
So one of the ministers in the government, Wayne Easter, was asked that question, and he said, although there's nothing in the legislation directly on this, his view and the government's interpretation of CERB is if you're recalled to work and there's not a good reason not to go back, then you won't get the CERB. So by analogy, you could argue the same thing, that, you know, if the public health authority has said it's safe to go back to work, and you decide not to, then you're resigning. But I think people don't generally refuse to work, especially if they're not getting paid, unless there's a reason. So I would really encourage people to find out what's going on.
Right. And we'll talk a little bit more maybe later about having the difficult conversations or the negotiation piece. Would one option be to treat it as an unpaid leave? Would that be another way of approaching a situation if the person's not coming back for some reason for a period of time?
Well, again, if they gave you a little bit more information about what the concern was, and it turned out they just needed a relatively short period of time before they're willing to come back, then a leave of absence is something you could offer as an alternative. Yeah.
One of the questions that's come in as sort of a follow-up to the earlier conversation is, what if the person is saying that they can't wear the mask either for health reasons, so asthma? Now, I think that's what you addressed in terms of perhaps they'd need a letter from their doctor saying that it's an accommodation that they require. But the other question was, what if they can't wear a mask for religious reasons?
It would be the same.
Same answer?
So you have to accommodate on the basis of religion as well. So
okay.
There's some religions that where you can't wear face coverings. So.
Okay. So a couple of questions have come in around people's concerns about getting to work. So if the person's safety concern may not be related to the workplace itself, but taking public transit to work. Can you speak to that and how an employer might deal with that concern?
Yeah, I think a lot of it will depend on how long the commute is, because, as you know, the city of Toronto, for example, they're increasing the number of bike lanes and encouraging people, to take their bikes as an alternative to public transit. And, walking obviously is another alternative. But if somebody lives, if they work in downtown Toronto, they live in Oakville or, OSHA, that's a long bike ride.
It is. It's a longer walk.
Yeah. So for that kind of thing, again, I think we're into the same kind of analysis as before. If the public health authorities have said it's safe to take public transit, and as long as you socially distance and so on, I think you're into the same, potential quit or insubordination or whatever.
So would it be fair to say, because the employer is responsible for the health and safety within the workplace and not responsible for how the employee gets to the workplace? Is that part of it?
Generally, that's the case. Yeah, most people, like people who report to one office location every day, they don't get paid till they get to work. It's their responsibility to get to work. And, unless there's a good legal reason for not showing up, then, an employer could argue they're abandoning the position.
So a question came in around, what if people are required to travel as part of their work between locations? Does that change the answer at all? So now it's that their work requires them to move between different locations, not just to get to work and go home, but within the course of their shift, they're moving between locations.
Normally people have a car when they do that. So would this be they're taking public transportation between locations?
I'm assuming from the question, maybe, yeah.
Yeah. So I think you have the same analysis. Like, again, if they had an underlying medical condition and the doctor said you can't take public transit, then the employer would have to accommodate. But if they're directed to go from location to location, that's always been part of their job, and the public health authorities say it's safe, and their doctors don't say otherwise, I think the employee's going to have a problem here.
Okay. Um, so I was going to transition because we've had a series of questions about the employer's responsibility to supply equipment in the for people who are working remotely. But
Yeah.
before we transition to that, was there anything else that sort of came to your mind that you wanted to touch on in terms of health and safety within the workplace with return to work? Are you anticipating this is going to be a significant challenge? I'm sort of imagining it will be.
I think it depends on sort of where we are on the curve, right? So I think people, if there's 600 new cases a day, so people are more sort of health conscious or sensitive, are going to be they're going to be feeling a lot better if it's under 200 or under 100, or we haven't seen cases for 3 days. So,
Right.
we have governments take different views on this. So you see the US, you see some of the Canadian provinces, and some jurisdictions are more aggressive to opening up. And they're ahead of the public in some cases. Sometimes they're behind.
Right.
So if you've got a government, who's a little bit more aggressive and the employee is a little more, health sensitive, then there's going to be a lag before it gets to a point where they're comfortable. But again, this is, assuming, things continue to get better, and let's not knock wood on that. I think most people, they may need a short period of time where they're not comfortable going to work. And you may, as an employer, this is a valuable contributing member to your team, and they've always been a good employee. And maybe you need to give them a little time to get to a place where they're comfortable.
It is an adjustment, because I think for those of us who've been working at home, much as there are challenges to working at home, we feel pretty safe at home. And so the idea of re-entering a workplace or wherever it is, and there's going to be more people around and just more issues, I think, so I hear you, it could be a transition and could require some transition time for people to get comfortable again.
The other thing, I think, will depend on whether remote work is possible. So if you've got somebody who works on a line, there's nothing they can do from home. But if they've been working from home remotely, doing their job, and they can continue to do it, then maybe working at home and not coming in is not such a bad thing in the short term.
Yeah. And again, it may help some employers to limit the number of people that they have to have in the office, so that not everybody comes back all at the same time. I've heard of some organizations where they're, having people, half the team comes in one week and half the team is going to come in the next week. And so they're kind of limiting exposure and limiting how many people are in the office at any given time. So I think there are going to be lots of things to think about and strategize depending on the specifics of your workplace. Yeah. Someone has put in a question about are there any parameters that employers need to keep in mind if they want to take employees' temperature? So if as part of their safety plan, they're taking the temperature of their employees, anything they need to think about with respect to that?
Well, that's a good question. The first thing comes to mind is the employee's privacy rights. This is not particularly invasive. It's not like you're asking for a saliva or a blood test. So I don't know if you could impose a requirement for a temperature check, but I don't know why anyone would object to that, frankly.
Okay. And a question came in, what if employees are required to stay at hotels? So I'm assuming this all gets filed under having to assess the risk associated with staying in a hotel. But if you have to stay in a hotel as part of your work.
So I guess it would be the same as we were talking about before, if the hotel's open and they have the requisite safety protocols that the Ministry of Labor has prescribed in their guidelines, and I don't see why an employer couldn't do that.
Okay. So let's transition for a moment to looking at the requirements that employers have for their employees while the employees are working remotely. So we had a couple of questions come in about whether the employer is required to provide computer equipment, desks, just the equipment that one might need to work from home, what the employer's obligation is in terms of setting up the location for the remote working.
Right. Well, there's under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, there's certain personal protective equipment an employer has to provide, but computers isn't one of them, or a computer chair. But generally, an employee is not required to provide equipment necessary for the job. So unless there's something in the contract that says the employee will provide their own, computer or phone or something like that, I don't think you could force an employee to buy it. You see in some employment contracts, an employee has to provide their own car, or they may have to provide their own cell phone, and that's specifically set out in the contract. But to say to an employee who has never had to buy equipment to do their job, you have to go out and buy a laptop or a desktop, or you have to go out and buy a phone, I don't think so.
And what about the flip side? So what if the employee is saying, I'd like my employer to provide me with an ergodynamic chair, or a special stand for my computer, or whatever it is, that it's the employee who wants the equipment and is asking the employer to make sure that they're safe in their home workplace?
Well, the employer does have there's a section in OSHA which says that private dwellings, OSHA doesn't apply to private dwellings. There's actually mixed case law on the applicability of OSHA to private homes. But quite apart from that, if the employee's working at home and gets a work-related injury, then you've got potential liability under workers' compensation legislation. Right? So if a person is sitting at their computer all day long and they get neck problems or carpal tunnel or back problems because there's not proper furniture, then the employer is going to have potential liability there. So I think it's in the employer's interest to make sure that they do what they can to make sure there's a safe workplace for the person.
Yeah. And quite apart from the legal issues, I suppose there are productivity issues as well. Like if you want people to be working effectively from home, ensuring that they have the proper equipment, maybe one significant piece of that. And people are asking about whether that would extend to the employer paying for internet and for the phone. And it sounds like all of these questions are maybe live questions, in the sense that OSHA doesn't specifically say that the employer has to provide those things.
Well, again, an employee normally doesn't provide the IT to get their work done. And so if the employer wants to use the employee's, IT at home or whatever, I guess the employer, switching it around, I guess the employee could say, well, I don't want to use my IT. I don't think it's an occupational health and safety issue. I think it's who bears the cost of the expenses the employee incurs out of a home office. And unless the employees agreed to assume those expenses, I think it's going to be hard for an employer to require them to pay.
Okay. And does that, and I'm just going to note, Doug, your video's turned off. Oh, there we go. We're back. Does that change if it's the employee who's requesting to work from home? So if the workplace is reopened, the employer is saying, please come back to work. The employee is saying, I have some concerns about that. My preference would be to work from home. Can I continue to work remotely? Does that at all impact the employer's obligations around equipment and supplies?
Well, then you're depending on the facts, then you're into a negotiation. So at that point, the employer could say, we want you back into work. If you want to work at home, you're going to have to pay these costs. We're not going to pay the costs, because if you came to work, we wouldn't have to pay those costs. And there's no reason why you can't come to work, assuming those are the facts. Right. So I think you're in a different situation there.
Hmm.
where the employee is, if it's a choice the employer is prepared to give, then they can put conditions on the remote working.
Okay. And I'd like to come back to that because I did say it would be interesting to hear your thoughts around the negotiation piece. I see one final question, which is, what if a coworker is displaying symptoms but claims it's allergies or is just waiting around till the end of the day, maybe for a ride home? So if you have a concern that maybe a coworker is sick, what might an employee do? I was going to say, assume tell the employer, but you tell us.
Well, if they genuinely believe this person might have a COVID because of a cough or a temperature or another symptom, if it were me, I'd go to my supervisor and say, hey, this person's exhibiting these symptoms. I'm not comfortable being anywhere close to them, so deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't deal with it, then I guess they could exercise their right to refuse work.
Okay.
If it's just an hour or two before the end of the day, I think that work refusal will get the job done.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there were a couple of things that came up in the conversation. So you mentioned work refusal, or if an employee perhaps is saying they're not comfortable or they prefer not to wear a mask, or asking an employee why they're refusing to return to work. And I think all of these are examples of situations where I think you're suggesting have a conversation. And it may be a difficult conversation, and it may be a negotiation to try to come up with a solution that makes sense for the employee and the employer. And I
Yep.
think sometimes people are uncomfortable with the concept of negotiating when we're in the legal realm, and there's a sense of, but they're legal rights and I should be protected, and why would I be negotiating? And same for the employer, like it's my right to require the employee to come back, why should I negotiate this? And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about why it might be important to try to negotiate a solution directly.
Yeah, so assuming both sides know what their legal rights are, the question is, do they want to assert them, right? In a litigious type situation. Now, most employer-employee relationship, it's an ongoing relationship. It's an indefinite relationship, and you want to take a longer-term view of things. So, again, having that conversation to figure out, are there options that can get us both what we need is,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very important. Um, this is COVID. We've never seen this before. And I have no doubt that people have genuine health concerns that may not seem reasonable to other people. But they're real. And those people may be prepared to, stay at home and not make any money, or actually give up their job because they feel so strongly about it.
Mm-hmm.
And although that may result in a no-cost termination to the employer, does the employer really want that? If we're talking about, this thing will resolve itself in a couple of 3 months, hopefully, is that really the solution? Exercising your strict legal rights, is that where you want to end up?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you say, is it where you want to end up? I mean, I think that's a good reminder for all of us, is that where we, I think, want to end up is a workplace that's safe, where people feel comfortable, where the work can be done, where we achieve productivity again, all of those things. And that's a shared goal, I think, in most workplaces. And these are very uncertain times to know how best to do that. So I think being informed of our legal rights is the important starting point. And then, as you've said, try to have some conversations and come up with some options that may meet the legitimate interests that both sides have. Because it's choppy waters these days, and we're going to have to try to figure out how to go forward.
Yeah.
So we're just coming to the end of our time. So I just wanted to again check in and see if there was anything else that you wanted to add, Doug, that we haven't touched on.
No, just sort of reinforce my last point, which is most people are not going to refuse to come to work, particularly if they're not getting paid, unless there's something there.
Yeah.
And so, the employee may not want to share it with the employer, but that's counterintuitive to me. And it suggests to me that people, they may have, again, enhanced health sensitivities that don't make sense to you or I, but make sense to them. And those sensitivities will dissipate as things continue to improve. So just take a medium, longer term view of these things. Some employers are very quick to insubordination or voluntary quit. And I think that's a very short term view in this kind of scenario.
And are you saying it's counterintuitive in your view for an employee not to share a little bit more information to help the employer to understand why they have the concern that they have?
No, it's counterintuitive for someone to stay at home and not get paid when the alternative is to go to work and get paid.
I see. Okay.
Particularly if they've been living on CERB for the last last 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
Most people are feeling the financial pain of not working, and so
Right.
to continue that and make that pain worse, that's counterintuitive to me.
I see. Okay. Okay. Well, I started this morning, Doug, by saying how grateful I was that you were willing to join us for this webinar and share your expertise. And I remain really grateful. I know when we did the last webinar together that we had lots of feedback from people that they found it really, really helpful. So I just want to thank you. You've been very generous with your time and your expertise today. So thank you. Really appreciate it. We'll let you go now. And I'll just invite the audience members to stay for the poll so you can give us some feedback on topics you'd like to hear from us in the future. But thanks again, Doug. Take good care. Okay, so we'll just have a poll. It's just going to ask you a couple of questions about yourself and a couple of questions about what you'd like to hear from us in terms of future webinars. Just a reminder that at the moment, our next webinar is scheduled for July the 14th at 11 and looking at how to have difficult conversations that are related to COVID. So Elizabeth will transition us to our poll. And thank you for joining us.